The marker hit the floor and the class went dead silent as Professor Hargrove smirked and wrote a blood-red equation across the board. Unsolvable, he said, then pointed straight at Elijah Carter, the quiet kid in a worn hoodie. Prove you belong here. Phones lifted, whispers spread. Someone laughed. Elijah walked up, slow, calm, like he'd seen this before. He stared at the equation, then at the professor, and asked one question that made the room shift. What if your assumption is wrong? The laughter died. He erased everything, rewrote it in seconds, and the professor's face drained color because this wasn't just right, it was beyond him. The door opened, the dean stepped in, eyes locked on Elijah, and suddenly everyone realized they weren't watching a student fail. They were watching a genius expose something far bigger. They called it an impossible equation. But what happened next exposed something far more impossible than math. The marker squeaked against the whiteboard as Professor William Hargrove wrote the final line in thick red ink. The word impossible underlined twice, like a verdict already decided. And then he turned slowly, scanning the room until his eyes landed on Elijah Carter sitting in the back row, quiet, still, almost invisible in a faded gray hoodie that didn't belong in a classroom filled with tailored jackets and polished confidence. Stay with me, because what happened in the next 5 minutes would later circulate across campus feeds and rack up millions of views, and people would argue for weeks about the exact moment the power shifted. Mr. Carter, the professor said, voice calm but sharpened with something colder, since you've been so silent, perhaps you'd like to demonstrate your understanding. A few students chuckled, the kind of laughter that didn't need permission, the kind that followed assumptions already made. Phones tilted upward just slightly, subtle at first, then more obvious, because moments like this had a way of becoming content. Elijah didn't move right away, and that pause stretched just long enough for the room to lean in, for the professor's smile to tighten, for the atmosphere to thicken with expectation. This wasn't just a question, it was a stage, and everyone could feel it. It's a graduate-level construct, Hargrove continued, tapping the equation with the marker, each tap echoing softly, but I'm sure you'll give it your best shot. More laughter, softer now, sharper. Elijah stood. No rush, no hesitation, just a controlled movement, like he had already decided something no one else understood yet. As he walked toward the board, the camera lenses followed, tiny reflections of curiosity and doubt flickering in the glass. His shoes barely made a sound on the tile floor, but somehow every step registered. He stopped inches from the equation, eyes scanning it once, then again, not searching, not struggling, just reading. The room waited. The professor folded his arms. And then Elijah did something no one expected. He didn't pick up the marker. He didn't start solving. Instead, he turned his head slightly and asked one quiet question, so calm it almost disappeared into the air. What if the assumption in line 3 is wrong? The laughter died first, then the whispers, then even the phone seemed to hold still. Because in that single sentence, something invisible cracked, and no one, not the class, not the cameras, not even Professor Hargrove, was ready for what that question was about to reveal. For a moment no one moved, not even Professor Hargrove, whose confidence had filled the room just seconds ago. His fingers tightened slightly around the marker, as if he was deciding whether to dismiss the question or address it, but Elijah did not look away. He simply stood there, calm, steady, waiting, and that silence stretched long enough to feel uncomfortable, long enough for the energy in the room to shift from amusement to uncertainty. The assumption is standard, Hargrove said finally, his voice measured but thinner now. It is not up for debate. But Elijah tilted his head just slightly, eyes returning to the board. It is as if it collapses the entire solution. A few students exchanged glances. Someone lowered their phone, then raised it again, this time, not to capture a failure, but something they did not yet understand. Hargrove let out a short breath and gestured toward the equation. Then show us. And there it was, the invitation that was no longer a trap, but something else entirely. Elijah reached for the marker this time, and the sound of the cap clicking off echoed louder than it should have. He stepped closer to the board, and instead of starting at the top, he circled line 3, the same line no one had questioned, and paused just long enough for the room to lean in again. This assumes convergence under conditions that are never proven, he said quietly, not performing, not rushing, just stating it like a fact he had already verified somewhere far beyond this classroom. The marker moved, clean, deliberate strokes, no hesitation, no backtracking. He rewrote the line, adjusted a variable, shifted a constraint, and suddenly the structure of the entire equation began to change, not dramatically, not all at once, but in subtle, precise ways that felt like watching a locked door open. One click at a time, the professor stepped forward just half a step, almost unconsciously, his eyes narrowing as he followed the symbols unfolding in front of him, because this was not guessing, this was not luck, this was method, and it was unfamiliar. That would invalidate the original boundary, Hargrove said, but the certainty was gone, now replaced with something closer to caution. Elijah nodded once without turning, exactly, and kept writing the board, filled line by line, the red ink of impossible, now surrounded by clean black logic that did not contradict it, but exposed it, and the room went completely silent. No whispers, no laughter, just the faint sound of marker against board and the soft hum of fluorescent lights above, as if even the building itself was paying attention. When Elijah finally stepped back, he did not look at the class, he looked at the professor and said nothing, because he did not need to. The equation stood there, complete, not simplified, not reduced, but solved on its own terms, and for the first time since the beginning of the lecture, Professor Hargrove did not speak immediately. He stared at the board, then at Elijah, then back at the board, as if searching for the mistake that had to be there and could not find it. And somewhere in the back of the room someone whispered, barely audible, "That is not even taught here." And that was the moment everyone realized this was no longer a lesson, it was a revelation. No one clapped, no one spoke, and that silence was louder than anything that had come before, because moments like this were not supposed to happen, not in rooms like this, not to people like him. Professor Hargrove set the marker down slowly, as if any sudden movement might break whatever fragile logic had just unfolded in front of him. "Explain your method," he said, but this time it was not a command, it was a request, and Elijah glanced at the board once more before answering. "It is not a method you teach here," he said simply, and that answer landed differently, not arrogant, not defensive, just factual. A few students shifted in their seats, the energy had changed completely. Phones were no longer pointed in secret, they were openly recording, now capturing something that felt bigger than a classroom demonstration. Hargrove stepped closer to the board, tracing the rewritten line with his eyes. "This approach assumes prior exposure to advanced convergence theory beyond this curriculum," he said, and Elijah nodded once. "Yes." A pause, then a breath, then something even quieter. "I studied it on my own." That was when the room reacted, not loudly, but collectively, a ripple of disbelief moving through rows of students who had spent months struggling through assigned material, let alone something beyond it. And in the back row someone whispered, "That is graduate level at least," while another voice added, "More than that." And the whispers built not into noise, but into recognition, because what they were watching was no longer surprising, it was undeniable. Hargrove turned fully toward Elijah, now no longer towering, no longer certain, just looking. "Where did you learn this?" he asked, and for the first time Elijah hesitated, not out of fear, but out of choice, as if deciding how much of himself to reveal. "Library access, online archives, open lectures, anywhere I could find it," he said, and there was no drama in it, no speech, just a list of places most people ignored. And yet somehow that answer carried more weight than anything else, because it stripped away the illusion that knowledge only lived inside institutions. Hargrove exhaled slowly, the kind of breath that comes when something internal shifts. "And you understood all of it?" he asked, and Elijah looked at him directly now. "I did not try to understand all of it," he said. "I tried to understand what was wrong with what I was given." And that line settled over the room like a quiet verdict, because it reframed everything, not just the equation, not just the moment, but the entire structure of how people in that room had been measuring intelligence all semester. One student in the front row lowered his phone, completely no longer interested in recording, because it no longer felt like entertainment, it felt like witnessing something that would not translate through a screen. Hargrove looked back at the board one more time, then at the word impossible still written in red. And without saying anything he reached up and erased it slowly, the ink smearing before disappearing entirely. And when he turned back his voice had changed. "Mr. Carter," he said carefully, "stay after class." And that sentence could have meant anything before, but now it carried a different weight, not authority, not correction, but recognition. And as the bell rang and students began to gather their things, no one rushed out, no one spoke loudly, because they all understood something had just shifted in a way they could not fully explain. And Elijah simply capped the marker, set it down, and walked back to his seat, as if nothing extraordinary had happened. But everyone in that room knew the equation had not been the test, it had been the mirror. The room emptied slower than usual, as if no one wanted to be the first to break whatever had just happened. Chairs scraped softly, backpacks zipped in low, hesitant motions, and conversation stayed quiet, almost respectful, but not out of politeness, out of confusion, because something they thought they understood had just been rewritten in front of them. Elijah stayed seated, hands resting loosely on the desk, his expression unchanged as the last few students stepped out into the hallway, their voices finally rising once the door closed behind them. And then it was just the two of them, the hum of the lights, the faint echo of footsteps outside, and the board still holding the solution like evidence that refused to disappear. Professor Hargrove stood near the front for a moment longer, not speaking, not moving, just looking at the equation, as if memorizing it, or perhaps trying to unlearn something that had been built over years. "You stayed quiet all semester," he said finally without turning around, and Elijah did not answer. Right away, not out of hesitation, but because the question itself did not seem to require one. "I was listening," he said simply, and that answer hung in the air longer than expected. Hargrove turned slowly, now studying him not as a student to evaluate, but as something he had not accounted for. "You could have spoken earlier," he said, and Elijah gave a small, almost unnoticeable nod. "I did not need to." Another pause, longer this time, not uncomfortable, just unfamiliar. Because this was no longer a conversation built on authority, it was something closer to balance. Hargrove stepped closer, resting his hand lightly against the desk in front of Elijah. "Do you understand what you did up there?" he asked, and Elijah met his gaze directly, calm, steady. "I answered your question," he said, and for a brief second something almost like a smile flickered across Hargrove's face, not amusement, not pride, but recognition of precision. "No," he said quietly. "You changed the question." And that was the first honest sentence he had spoken since the lecture began. The weight of it settled between them, and neither rushed to fill the silence outside the hallway. Noise grew louder, students passing by, voices overlapping, fragments of what had already begun to spread. "Did you see that?" He solved it differently. "That was not even in the syllabus." And somewhere a phone buzzed again, a notification, a clip already being shared, already leaving the room, and moving into something much larger. Hargrove glanced briefly toward the door, then back at Elijah. "There are standards here, expectation structures that exist for a reason," he said, but the certainty in his voice had softened, not disappeared, just adjusted. Elijah listened without interruption, then answered in the same tone he had used from the beginning. "Standards help people measure progress," he said, "but they do not define it." And that line landed with a quiet finality, not challenging, not defiant, just complete. Hargrove exhaled slowly, stepping back, as if giving the space itself more room to breathe. "You are not enrolled in the advanced track," he said, and Elijah shook his head once. "No." Why? The question came faster this time, more direct, and Elijah looked down briefly at the desk, then back up. "Because I did not apply," he said, and that answer seemed to catch Hargrove off guard more than anything else. Not the solution, not the method, but the absence of ambition within the system. He understood, and for the first time, he did not have a response ready. The silence returned, but it felt different now, not uncertain, not tense, just open, and in that space something subtle shifted again, not in the equation, not in the room, but in how one man was beginning to see the other, and how that understanding would not stay contained for long. The hallway noise faded as the classroom door clicked shut again, and for a moment it felt like the world outside had been paused, leaving only the quiet weight of what had already happened between them. Professor Hargrove walked back toward the board, slower, this time his steps measured, as if he was thinking through something he had not planned to think about today. He picked up the eraser again, not to remove anything new, but to clear the remaining marks around the solution until only Elijah's work remained centered, clean, undeniable. "You did not apply," he repeated, more to himself than to Elijah, and there was something different in the way he said it now, not disbelief, but curiosity sharpened by something closer to concern. Elijah remained seated, posture relaxed, but attentive, as if this conversation mattered just enough to stay present, but not enough to prove anything. "No," he said again, and the simplicity of that answer seemed to carry more weight the second time. Hargrove turned halfway, leaning against the desk, his arms no longer crossed, no longer defensive. "Most students in your position would chase every opportunity available, especially with that level of understanding," he said, and Elijah listened without interrupting, then responded with the same quiet precision. "Most students are trying to prove something," he said. "I was trying to learn something, and that Distinction landed deeper than the equation ever had because it reframed not just Elijah's choices, but the entire system surrounding them. Hargrove let out a slow breath, the kind that comes when a realization settles in layers instead of all at once. Do you know how many students sit in this room, trying to meet expectations they do not fully understand? He asked, and Elijah nodded once. Yes. And you chose not to participate in that. Hargrove continued, and Elijah gave a slight shrug. Not dismissive, just honest. I chose not to depend on it, he said, and outside another wave of voices passed by, louder this time, more animated fragments of the moment continuing to travel beyond the classroom. He rewrote the whole thing. The professor did not even respond right away. That clip is already everywhere. And the sound of a phone vibrating on a desk cut through the room. Briefly, Hargrove glanced toward it, then back at Elijah, his expression shifting again, something quieter, something more deliberate. This will not stay in this room, he said, and Elijah followed his gaze toward the door, then back again. It already did not, he replied, and there was no pride in it, no performance, just awareness of how things moved now, how quickly a moment could become something larger than the people inside it. Hargrove straightened slightly, stepping away from the desk. There are processes here for placement, evaluation, advancement, he said, as if returning to something familiar, but even that structure sounded different now, less rigid, more like a framework being reconsidered. You should be in a different program, he added, and Elijah tilted his head slightly, considering that for a moment before answering. Maybe, he said, and that single word held neither acceptance nor rejection, just possibility, and Hargrove paused again, longer this time, because he was no longer speaking to a student who needed direction. He was speaking to someone who had already built his own, and that realization changed everything about what came next. The next sound did not come from inside the room. It came from Elijah's pocket, a soft vibration that seemed louder than it should have in the quiet space between them. He reached down slowly, not rushed, not curious, just aware, and glanced at the screen for less than a second before placing the phone back on the desk face down. Professor Hargrove noticed the movement, but did not ask what it was, because he already understood what it meant. The moment had crossed the boundary. It was no longer contained, and whatever came next would not be controlled by either of them. It has started spreading, Hargrove said, not as a question, but as a recognition, and Elijah gave a small nod. Yes. Outside the door, footsteps passed faster, now voices sharper, more animated, fragments of reactions slipping through the walls. That is him in the video. No way he did that in real time. Someone said. The dean already saw it. And the energy that had once been confined to a single classroom was now moving through hallways, screens, conversations multiplying with every second. Hargrove walked toward the door, but did not open it. Instead, he stood there listening, not to the words, but to the shift in tone, the difference between curiosity and recognition. And when he turned back, his expression had changed again, not uncertain, not analytical, but something closer to acceptance. This will redefine how they see you, he said, and Elijah remained still for a moment before answering. It might redefine how they see themselves. And that line settled deeper than anything else, because it shifted the focus away from individual attention and toward something broader, something structural. Hargrove took a step back from the door, returning to the center of the room, where the board still held the solution untouched since Elijah had stepped away from it. You challenged more than a problem today, he said quietly, and Elijah did not deny it. The problem was never the equation, he replied, and that response did not feel like a statement. It felt like a conclusion already reached long before this moment. Hargrove looked at the board again, at the space where the word impossible had been erased, and then at the clean logic that had replaced it. Do you realize how many assumptions are built into a place like this? He asked, and Elijah's answer came just as steady, enough that people stopped questioning them. And for the first time, Hargrove did not respond immediately, because he was no longer searching for a counterpoint. He was recognizing the truth in what had been said. The phone on the desk vibrated again, this time longer, more persistent, and Elijah picked it up, briefly glancing at the screen a second time before setting it down again. Without unlocking it, Hargrove watched that small action closely, not because of the message, but because of what it represented: control, not over the situation, but over himself. You are not reacting to any of it, he said, and Elijah shook his head slightly. It does not change what happened, he said, and that calm refusal to engage with the noise outside the room stood in sharp contrast to the growing intensity beyond the walls. Hargrove exhaled slowly, then moved back toward the front desk, placing both hands on it, as if grounding himself in something more certain. "There will be people who try to define this moment for you," he said, and Elijah met his gaze directly. "They can try," he answered, and that was enough, not defiance, not challenge, just certainty. And as another wave of voices passed outside, louder, now closer to the door, Hargrove realized something that had not been clear before. This was not a moment Elijah needed to navigate. It was a moment everyone else would have to catch up to, and in that realization the roles had fully shifted, not announced, not dramatic, but undeniable. The knock on the door was soft, but deliberate, and both of them turned at the same time, not startled, just aware that whatever had been building outside had finally arrived. Professor Hargrove crossed the room and opened it halfway, and the dean stood there composed but observant, her eyes moving past him immediately to the board, then to Elijah, as if she had already seen enough to understand what this moment represented. "Professor," she said with a slight nod before stepping inside. Without waiting for an invitation, the air shifted again, not tense, not heavy, just more defined, as if another layer of reality had entered the room. "Mr. Carter," she added, her voice calm, measured, carrying the weight of someone used to making decisions that extended beyond a single classroom. Elijah stood slowly, not out of obligation, but out of acknowledgement, meeting her gaze with the same steady composure he had held from the beginning. "Dean Whitaker," he said, and the familiarity in his tone suggested this was not the first time he had been noticed, even if it was the first time it had been made visible like this. The dean glanced briefly at the board again, taking in the structure, the rewritten logic, the absence of the word that had once defined it. "I have seen the recording," she said, and for a moment the room felt smaller, not because of pressure, but because of clarity. "It is circulating quickly," she continued, and Hargrove stepped slightly to the side, not leading, not interrupting, just allowing the conversation to unfold in a way he no longer needed to control. "Yes," Elijah said simply, and the dean studied him for a second longer, as if measuring something that could not be quantified on paper. "What you demonstrated is not a matter of placement, it is a matter of alignment," she said, and that distinction carried a different kind of authority, one that did not come from hierarchy, but from recognition of scale. "There are programs here designed for students operating at a different level," she added, and Elijah listened without reaction, his posture unchanged, his expression neutral but attentive. "I am aware," he replied, and the dean nodded, once not surprised by the answer, but by the way it was delivered, without urgency, without ambition, just awareness. "Then you also understand that remaining where you are will create complications," she said, choosing the word carefully, as if it covered more than just curriculum, and Elijah gave a slight nod. "For the system," he said, and that response shifted the dynamic again because it reframed the concern not as his limitation, but as theirs. The dean's expression softened, almost imperceptibly, not in disagreement, but in recognition of the precision in his words. "For everyone involved," she clarified, and there was no tension in the correction, just a broader scope. "We would like to discuss options with you, opportunities that reflect what you have already demonstrated," she continued, and outside the hallway noise surged again, louder, closer, more immediate, the sound of footsteps, gathering voices, overlapping, the energy no longer passing by, but gathering near the door. "They are outside," Hargrove said quietly, not as a warning, but as an observation, and the dean glanced toward the door for a brief second before returning her attention to Elijah. "That is not the important part," she said, and Elijah met her gaze directly. "No," he agreed, and in that moment the noise outside lost its weight entirely, because what was happening inside the room was no longer about attention or reaction, it was about direction, and as the dean took a step closer and the voices outside grew clearer, it became evident that whatever decision came next would not just follow the moment, it would define everything that came after. The voices outside the door grew louder, now no longer passing, but gathering, a low, steady hum of curiosity pressing against the walls, as if the moment inside had begun to pull people toward it without invitation. Dean Whitaker did not turn toward the noise. She remained focused on Elijah, as if the decision in front of her carried more weight than anything happening beyond the room. "There are pathways we can offer immediately," she said, her tone calm but precise. "Accelerated placement, independent research, direct faculty mentorship." Each option laid out clearly, not as pressure, but as structure, and Elijah listened without interruption, his expression unchanged. but attentive as if measuring not the value of the opportunities, but the intention behind them. Professor Hargrove remained silent near the board, his presence no longer leading the conversation, but anchoring it, his eyes moving between Elijah and the dean, as if witnessing a shift he could no longer control, but fully understood. You would not be starting from where they are, the dean continued. You would be moving from where you already are, and that distinction echoed in the room because it acknowledged something no transcript had yet recorded. Elijah glanced briefly at the board again, the solution still untouched, then back at the dean. And where do you think I am? He asked the question, not confrontational, not rhetorical, just exact, and the dean paused for the first time, considering not the answer itself, but how to define something that had not been formally recognized. Ahead, she said finally, not just in knowledge, but in how you approach it. And that answer held more weight, because it moved beyond measurable skill into something deeper, something harder to categorize. Elijah nodded, once accepting the clarity of it without reacting to the implication. Then moving me does not change that, he said, and the dean's eyes narrowed slightly, not in disagreement, but in focus. It changes what you have access to, she replied, and Elijah considered that for a moment. The room quiet again, except for the distant murmur outside, growing more concentrated closer to the door. Access to what? He asked, and the dean answered without hesitation. Resources, people, problems that match your level. And that word match lingered because it suggested alignment, not elevation, not correction, but recognition of where he already stood. Elijah looked down briefly at the desk, then back up. And if the problems are still built on the same assumptions? He asked, and the question shifted the conversation again from opportunity to structure, from advancement to foundation. The dean held his gaze for a moment longer, then allowed a small measured breath. Then you will be in a position to challenge them, she said, and for the first time, there was something almost like agreement in her tone, not institutional, not procedural, but personal, as if she understood that what had happened in the last hour was not an exception, it was a pattern beginning to surface. The phone on Elijah's desk vibrated again, longer this time, the screen lighting up briefly before dimming, and neither of them looked at it because it no longer mattered. The noise outside had reached the door, now a cluster of voices, indistinct, but present, waiting not for confirmation, but for access. And Professor Hargrove finally stepped forward, just slightly, his voice quiet, but steady. They are expecting something, he said, and Elijah turned his head toward the door for a brief second, then back again. They already have it, he replied, and in that moment it became clear that whatever came next would not be shaped by expectation or reaction, but by something far more deliberate, something that could not be rushed by the noise gathering just inches away. The handle on the door shifted slightly, not opening, but testing, as if the crowd outside had reached the point where waiting was no longer enough. And inside the room the air held steady, unaffected by the pressure building just inches away. Dean Whitaker glanced once toward the movement, then back to Elijah, her focus unbroken. This is the moment where most people decide who they are in the eyes of others, she said, her voice calm, but carrying a quiet weight that suggested experience beyond this single situation. And Elijah stood still for a second longer before reaching for his phone, not to check it, but to turn it completely off, placing it back on the desk with a soft, deliberate motion that echoed louder than expected. That is not something I need to decide right now, he said, and the simplicity of that answer seemed to pause even the noise outside, as if the room itself had shifted into a different rhythm. Professor Hargrove watched that action closely, not because of the device, but because of what it represented: control, not over the situation, but over attention, over timing, over what mattered. They are waiting for you to step out there, Hargrove said quietly, and Elijah looked toward the door again, just briefly, then back. They are waiting for something they already believe, he replied, and that line settled into the room with a clarity that removed any urgency from the moment. Dean Whitaker took a small step forward, her posture composed, but intent. Perception can shape opportunity, whether you engage with it or not, she said, and Elijah nodded, once acknowledging the truth in it without yielding to it. Opportunity is only useful if it aligns with purpose, he answered, and the word purpose seemed to redirect the conversation away from immediate decisions into something deeper, something that would outlast whatever was happening outside the door. Hargrove exhaled, slowly stepping back again, as if recognizing that this was no longer a situation to manage, but something to observe unfolding in real time. Then what is your purpose? He asked, and this time Elijah did not answer. Immediately, not because he did not know, but because the question itself required more than a quick response. The silence stretched, not uncomfortable, not tense, just deliberate, as if the space was allowing the answer to form fully before it was spoken. And when Elijah finally spoke, his voice was steady, but softer than before, to understand what others accept without question. He said, and that answer carried through the room with a quiet certainty that made everything else feel secondary. The dean held his gaze for a moment longer, then gave a slight nod, not agreement, not approval, but recognition of something she could not redefine. Then whatever path you choose will not be conventional, she said, and Elijah responded just as calmly, it does not need to be. Outside, the voices rose again, closer, now more insistent, a few distinct knocks followed by hushed laughter and whispered speculation, building into a pressure that most people would feel compelled to respond to, but inside the room nothing rushed, nothing shifted. The board still held the solution, the absence of the word impossible still visible in its place, and the three of them stood there not as authority and student, but as participants in a moment that had already moved beyond classification. And as the door handle turned again, more firmly this time, it became clear that whatever waited outside was not what would define what happened next. It would only react to it. The door finally opened, not all the way, but enough for the noise to spill, and fully, voices, overlapping footsteps, shifting, phones raised, not hidden anymore, but openly pointed toward the room. And for a brief second, the outside world collided with the quiet control inside it. Dean Whitaker did not move. Professor Hargrove did not speak, and Elijah stood exactly where he was, not stepping forward, not stepping back, just present. As the hallway filled the doorway with expectation, "Is he still in there?" someone whispered too loudly, and another voice followed. "That is him, that is the guy from the video." And just like that, the moment that had belonged to three people now belonged to everyone. But Elijah did not turn toward them immediately. Instead, he looked once more at the board, the solution still clear, untouched, the absence of the word that had defined the beginning now more visible than anything else. And then he stepped forward. Not toward the door, but toward the front of the room, picking up the marker one more time, the sound of it against the board cutting through the noise behind him, as he drew a single line beneath the equation, not adding to it, not changing it, just marking it complete. And that small action did something unexpected. It quieted the hallway, not completely, but enough for the shift to be felt, because what they were watching was no longer a reaction, it was a decision. He set the marker down again, and only then did he turn toward the door, toward the people, the cameras, the attention, and for the first time his presence faced them directly, not performing, not addressing, just existing in a way that did not match what they expected. Dean Whitaker stepped slightly to the side, not guiding, not blocking, just allowing space for what would happen next, and Professor Hargrove remained still, his eyes on Elijah, not as a teacher observing a student, but as someone witnessing a moment that could not be reversed. "Are you going to say something?" a voice from the hallway called out, half curious, half demanding, and a few others echoed it, softer but eager, and Elijah looked at them for a brief second, not scanning, not acknowledging individuals, just seeing the collective of expectation in front of him. And then he shook his head once, a small movement, but enough. "There is nothing to say," he said, his voice calm, clear, carrying through the doorway without effort, and that answer did not satisfy them. It confused them, because it did not follow the script they were expecting. No explanation, no reaction, no claim, just silence shaped into words. And for a moment, the hallway hesitated, unsure how to respond to something that did not engage with it. Professor Hargrove watched closely, realizing that this was the final shift, not in knowledge, not in authority, but in control of narrative. And Dean Whitaker's expression remained steady, but there was a subtle recognition in her eyes that this decision mattered more than any placement or program could define, because Elijah had just refused something most people never questioned the need to respond. And as the hallway noise slowly began to change from demand to uncertainty, from expectation to observation, it became clear that the moment had reached its true conclusion, not when the equation was solved, but when he chose not to explain it. The hallway did not return to noise right away. Instead, it settled into something quieter, something uncertain, as if the absence of a reaction had created a gap. No one knew how to fill. Phones were still raised, but no one spoke first, not because they did not want to, but because they did not know what to say when the expected moment had already passed. Without them, Elijah did not wait for anything further. He simply stepped forward, moving past the threshold of the classroom, and into the hallway, not pushing through, not acknowledging the space around him, just walking with the same steady pace he had carried from the beginning, and the crowd parted without instruction, not out of respect, not out of fear, but because something about his presence did not invite interruption. It redirected it. Professor Hargrove remained at the doorway, watching, not with authority, but with awareness, as if understanding now that the most important part of what had happened could not be taught or measured. Dean Whitaker followed a step behind, not to guide, not to intervene, but to observe how this moment would continue to unfold outside the controlled space of the classroom. "That is him," someone said again, but softer now, less certain, as if the statement itself no longer held the same weight. Elijah did not slow down, he did not stop, he did not look at the screens that followed him, capturing angles, fragments, perspectives that would later be edited, replayed, discussed, but never fully understood, because what they were recording was not the event, it was the aftermath of something they had not seen clearly enough in real time. A student near the lockers lowered their phone, completely watching instead of recording, and that small shift repeated itself, one by one, until the hallway was no longer filled with cameras, but with eyes, and in that change something subtle but important happened. The moment stopped being content and became something else, something closer to reflection. Dean Whitaker noticed it first, the way attention shifted from capturing to considering, and she allowed a small nod, not to Elijah, not to anyone in particular, but to the recognition that this was no longer a situation to manage, it was something to witness. Professor Hargrove stepped out into the hallway as well, stopping just short of following, not because he could not, but because he understood that whatever path Elijah was taking now did not require him. And that realization settled differently than anything else that had happened that day. Elijah reached the end of the hallway where it opened into a wider corridor, sunlight cutting across the floor through tall windows, creating a contrast between the quiet interior and the open space ahead. And for the first time he paused, not turning back, not looking around, just standing there for a brief second, as if marking the transition, not from one place to another, but from one state to another. The noise behind him remained low, controlled, no longer pressing forward, no longer demanding, and in that stillness the weight of the moment became clear, not because of what had been shown, but because of what had been refused. And as Elijah took the next step forward into the light, the hallway behind him did not follow it, simply watched, and in that distance something unspoken settled into everyone present, the understanding that what they had just witnessed was not the end of a moment, but the beginning of something they were not yet ready to define. The sunlight stretched across the polished floor as Elijah stepped into it, not dramatically, not symbolically, just naturally, as if this path had always been there waiting to be walked, and behind him the hallway remained still, not empty but quieter in a way that suggested something had settled into place. Professor Hargrove stood at the edge of that space, no longer thinking about equations or curriculum or authority, but about the moment when he had first written the word that no longer existed on the board, and how easily it had been erased, not by force, not by argument, but by clarity. Dean Whitaker watched Elijah's figure move forward through the corridor, blending into the flow of campus life, without announcement, without recognition from those who had not witnessed what had happened, and she understood something that could not be written into policy or program structure. Some individuals do not move through systems, they reveal them, and in doing so they change the way those systems see themselves. A group of students further down the hall passed by Elijah without stopping, without knowing, and that contrast between awareness and ignorance did not diminish what had happened, it defined it, because the moment had never required an audience to exist, only to be recognized, and recognition had already occurred where it mattered. Elijah did not look back, not because he was dismissing what had happened, but because there was nothing behind him that required revisiting. The equation was solved, the assumptions were exposed, the reactions had already begun to unfold, and whatever came next would not be built on repetition, it would be built on continuation. Back in the classroom, the board still held the final lines, clean, precise, untouched by the noise that had surrounded them earlier, and Professor Hargrove walked back inside, slowly stopping in front of it, not to analyze, not to correct, but to observe, as if seeing it clearly for the first time, without the weight of expectation. "It was never impossible," he said quietly to no one in particular, and Dean Whitaker, who had followed partway into the room, gave a small nod, not in agreement, but in acknowledgement of the shift that statement represented, because it was not about the equation, it was about the lens through which it had been viewed. Outside, the hallway resumed its movement, students returning to schedules, conversations shifting to other topics, the moment already fragmenting into versions, stories, interpretations. But inside the room, something remained intact, something that would not be reduced to a clip or a headline, because it had not been created for that purpose. It had been revealed. Elijah continued walking until the corridor opened fully into the campus quad, the air brighter, the space wider, the noise more diffuse, and for a brief second he slowed, not stopping, just adjusting his pace, as if aligning with something internal rather than external, and then he kept moving forward, blending into the larger rhythm of the day, unnoticed by most, understood by few, and as he disappeared into the distance, the only thing left behind was not the memory of what he had solved, but the quiet question that remained in the minds of those who had seen it unfold, not whether he was capable, but how many other things they had already accepted without ever thinking to ask why. And somewhere in that question the real answer waited, not written on a board, not spoken out loud, but present in the silence that followed.